This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. We've talked about a lot of old things on this podcast, including the oldest building in Minnesota and one of the world's oldest rocks. Today, we're going to be talking about a journey to see another ancient artifact, the oldest known tree in Minnesota. We got a question on this topic at the State Fair last year from Anthony Lopez.
What is the oldest tree in Minnesota?
Just over 5 months after we received Anthony's question, sled dogs were pulling Star Tribune cartographer Jake Steinberg and photographer Anthony Soufflé across the icy lakes of northern Minnesota's boundary waters.
Good dogs. Good dogs.
They were there in search of a cedar tree that some say is more than 1,100 years old. You can see some great photos, videos, and maps about this in the story that they produced, which I will link to in the show notes. Here's my conversation with Jake and Anthony. Well, Anthony and Jake, thanks so much for joining us today. So, this is an unusual story because this was like a little question, kind of like, I think we got it maybe twice. One was at the State Fair, and then it turned into an adventure. Life-changing, perhaps. I don't know. You'll probably have this story for the rest of your lives. Okay, so Jake, you first took the story, you saw it, and you were like, I want to look into that. What drew you to it, and then what was sort of your next steps to sort of figure out what is the oldest tree?
Yeah, definitely. I was looking at the Curious Minnesota questions and spotted this one, and it just stuck out to me. I've always been very fascinated by old trees. I think because living in Minnesota, we don't have a lot of old trees. Most of the trees have been cut down at some point. And so they just have this sort of mystique. I was also reading about old trees at the time, so I was just like, mine.
You were reading about old trees?
Yeah, I was reading The Overstory by Richard Powers.
Okay.
It's a really fantastic non-fictional account of trees, tree personhood. It's fantastic.
Okay. So what is the steps? I mean, obviously we Google when we get a question, just see what's out there. But I mean, what are the steps to sort of even hone in on what we need to look at?
Yeah, like anyone else, I Googled it. What is the oldest tree in Minnesota? And I expected to get some sort of, DNR Forest Service page saying, this is it, this is the oldest one. Instead, what I find are old Boundary Waters message board posts from like 2007. People posting pictures with this blurry tree saying, here I am with the oldest tree in Minnesota. And this was really the only information I could drum up about this tree. And so it was really compelling because it seemed like there was some conjecture about its age. There was no location available. As a matter of fact, I found people suggesting that they should keep the location of this tree secret. And it turns out that folks who do know where this tree is do tend to keep it secret. They don't want it to be really widely visited because they're trying to protect it.
And did we sort of obscure its location a little bit, or did we?
Yeah, we blew it. No, we also protected its location. So you can read about it, but we're not, in the story, we don't tell you where to find it exactly.
Okay.
And that is kind of part of the mystique of the tree is you do have to seek it out. So many people I spoke with for the story were taken to the tree by someone else and kind of continuing this chain of being taken to the tree.
Right. So this story took on a much bigger life, in part because there's some climate change implications for this tree. And we're going to talk about that later on in the conversation. But you took this to the bosses, you made a pitch, and they actually saw something big here. And that's where, Anthony, you came into the picture because this turned into a journey. This turned into a trip, a winter trip, which I wasn't expecting. I guess I was thinking, well, if it's in the Boundary Waters, you just take a canoe in the summer. Why was it winter?
We usually do Boundary Waters stories and trips like that in the summertime. So all of our photos have, canoes and water and loons and all that stuff in it. And at the time that Jake started first looking into this, it was still cold and the lakes were still frozen and everything. So the options were to either wait for everything to thaw, which would be months, from where we were, or to go out via dog sled. And it just kind of presented itself as a very different visual experience, both for us and for the readers and, just kind of everyone involved. And we just kind of thought that was a really interesting element to the trip. Everyone goes up there canoeing in the summer. It's very common. Not a ton of people go dog sledding. So we kind of wanted to take you on a different kind of adventure.
Okay, I mean, I've been to the Boundary. I go to Boundary Waters just about every year. I know kind of generally what I would pack for a summer trip. So then there's this winter element and there's this tech because you got a lot of stuff you need to bring. Like, how'd you even plan this whole thing? Because there was you had to put a lot of thought into that, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that was probably one of the most difficult aspects of the entire trip is just logistics of getting everything that you need together and there at the entry point on the day of put in, because like you said, we had to pack all kinds of camping stuff. They provide the sleep systems for us, but we still have to pack all of our clothes and our winter gear, our layers, and they go through your entire kit with you the night before to make sure that you're outfitted correctly and that you're not going to freeze to death at night. But, we had to pack all of our gear in that sense. But then I had to pack all the camera gear on top of that. And, the primary concern for everything was just battery life.
Mm-hmm.
We're out there for, what was it, 7 days, Jake?
5 days we were out there?
Wow.
Yeah.
Felt
5
like
days
7.
of winter
5 days.
camping?
Yeah.
Oh, my
Yeah.
God.
It
Okay.
was 5 days of winter camping. It felt like 7 sometimes.
Yeah.
No.
It feels like 7 just thinking about it. Okay,
Right.
yeah.
But we were out there for 5 days. So, for 5 days, I don't get a chance to throw anything on the charger. So I've got to pack enough batteries to get me through 5 days of shooting, every day. And then, we visited the tree on the second to last day, I think. So I had, it wasn't like we were going to see the tree right away and I could, just get the photos done and, not worry terribly much about the battery life after that. It was, we have to make sure that we have batteries that are holding out all the way until we get to the tree. So
is it because the journey was so long that it took that many days just to get there, essentially?
Yeah, when we went up, we're kind of limited by what the dogs can do every day, but also by the terrain. And, we'll get into this more with the climate change aspect, but there wasn't a ton of snow on those portage trails. So the dogs had to work extra hard to kind of get us across those portages, which really takes it out of them and slows the amount of time and distance that you can travel every day.
Yeah, because if you're going canoeing, you just take your canoe over the portage trails. Well, I guess you take your bag separately, but it's a little different.
Normally, there's a couple feet of snow on the portages, so the dogs and the sleds can go right over everything. But when we were up there was hardly, any snow on some of those portages. And so we're pushing those sleds over rocks and beaver dams and downed logs and trying to help the dogs along.
Yeah.
It wasn't easy going by any stretch of the word. Aside from the portages, when we were moving over the lakes, it was all ice. So that was just kind of an interesting experience in itself because the dogs can move so much quicker over the ice because there's so much less resistance on the sled. So they got kind of wild there on those last couple of days when we take some turns really fast with the dogs and the sled's fishtailing out from underneath you. It's just kind of a wild experience.
Yeah,
Wow.
we did have to do some skiing as well because only 2 people can be on the sled at a given time. As the youngest person on our team, I was often the one who was doing the skiing,
Yeah,
and
we
I
definitely punted that to Jake.
I did face
multiple
plant
times.
once on the ice.
Like you're kind of doing almost like ice skating style skiing?
Basically, yeah.
Wow.
They gave us these skis that had steel tips just to
Yeah.
give us traction on the ice.
Wow. Okay. And you're living with these dogs, and we have a little audio of what this sounds like. It's kind of this. I don't know if the howling was constant or if it's just dinner time. I think you mentioned
It comes and goes. It ebbs and flows.
Okay.
Yeah, these dogs were voracious. I think more wolf-like than any dog I've ever spent a lot of time around. They were always kind of fighting with each other, very friendly towards people, but just very feral almost. I was giving one a belly rub. And I was like, this dog has a 6-pack. This
Yeah.
is insane.
And so we've been sort of alluding to your guides this whole time, but who's leading all this? Who's getting all this together?
Yeah, so I was trying to find someone who knew where this tree was. So I was just kind of making contact with various guides and outfitters up in Ely because I learned that many of them would take clients to this tree as part of guided trips. So I got in touch with Paul Shirky. He is the owner of Wintergreen Dog Sled Lodge. And Paul Shirky is like this intrepid Arctic explorer. He's been to the North Pole 7 times.
Wow.
Most famously, in the 80s, he went on a trip that the Star Tribune actually covered. And it took him about 2 months via dog sled, unsupported, him and Will Steger to go to the North Pole.
Wow.
So Paul knows his stuff. And so it was his outfitter that took us out there. And they helped out with, a lot of the logistics of winter camping are like, how do you stay warm? And they had everything dialed in from the food, the sleep systems. We were sleeping in these thermal liners in a giant down sleeping bag in a, windscreen liner.
Yeah,
and we would
bivy
sack. We'd boil water and throw it in our Nalgene and like cuddle it at night just to stay warm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And is it just you two and Paul?
No.
We totally crashed some people's vacation. And for that, we felt kind of bad. But no, this was a pre-scheduled trip that they had, and they happened to be going relatively near to the legacy tree. And Paul said that he had space on the agenda to hop us on. So Jake and I joined these 4 guys who were just on a random winter vacation. They go dog sledding every year, it sounds like, and we just kind of jumped right in on their vacation, and they were very gracious and very accommodating for us. So
would you go on a vacation? And now knowing what this is like, would you do this as a vacation?
It's definitely type 2 fun.
Okay,
that's a term that got thrown out a lot there. Fun with one of those situations where while you're doing it, you're like, oh man, this is horrible, but then you look back and you're like, no, that was fun.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
There's a lot of that.
There was one night, maybe the third or fourth night, when we were just shivering around the fire, and Anthony came over to me and he's just like, I'm over this. I'm sick of being cold.
Let's be done.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. I mean, because this was in February, or
yeah.
Okay, this is in February. It's probably, what was the temperatures like?
It varied. We had some, especially during the day, some decently
really
warm
nice
days
days.
in the 30s, but especially in the latter half of the trip, it got down to 0. I don't think it ever got super nice. The last day was so windy.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. At night, it would get pretty cold. It got down to about 0 a few of those nights that we were out there.
We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. So we lost the tree here. We had to talk about the journey. Okay, so you get to this tree. Now, what does the oldest tree in Minnesota look like? This is a cedar tree, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a northern white cedar.
And so this isn't like a redwood. It's not like a super, super tall tree.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of people expect an old tree to be like, is tall and towering. But this tree couldn't be more than like 30 feet tall. And that's actually, the Boundary Waters is a pretty inhospitable place for trees over time. There's a lot of fires there. It gets very intense windstorms, and a lot of it was logged. And so the survivors actually tend to be pretty stubby. And so, yeah, this tree, it definitely looked old. I mean, it was incredibly gnarled, its roots. I mean, Anthony, I think at one point said it looked like a giant bonsai tree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can see the picture. We'll link to the story in the show notes so you can see all these pictures. But yeah, tell us about it.
Yeah, it's not terribly far from the water's edge, which was all frozen. It was all ice when we were there. But one of the things I just remember being struck by is, you kind of walk up to it and it doesn't look terribly impressive or incredible or unique, really. It just kind of looks like, it looks weathered. It looks, it looks old, but it doesn't quite, there's no like mystic aura about it or anything. It's just kind of hanging out there. And, that's part of the beauty of it, I think, is that, it's just kind of one of many trees, up there in the Boundary Waters. But, it happens to be the oldest, or so we think. Right.
So let's talk about oldest and how old. Since you took the story, Jake, and you were there to answer the question, what's the oldest tree? This is the oldest tree, but then how old is it? Right?
Well,
is the next question.
I should add the caveat. It might be the oldest tree.
Okay.
We don't know. We can't know how old
oldest
it truly
known
is.
Tree, right? That's how we would probably.
Yeah, it's so old that the interior of the tree has actually rotted, and so that's we're tree rings, right? We're losing kind of information there. So there were 2 Boundary Waters researchers in like the 60s or 70s who bored a core into the tree, and it's just like this little pencil-sized sliver of wood, and they pull it out and they count the rings, and that's kind of how they make their age estimate. But so much of the tree was missing because of the interior rotting. They had to extrapolate. And so, based on just like how much remaining space there would have been in the tree, they figured it was over 1,100 years old was their estimate. Now, I spoke with a lot of modern tree scientists who kind of doubt that estimate, who say they can't corroborate it, that sort of extrapolation method is a little squishy, but nonetheless, it's very old in any case.
And so what's happening what has this tree been through? I mean, you know some of these in the stories, but what kind of history has this tree lived through then, just to put this into some perspective?
Yeah, I spoke with a Forest Service archaeologist who told me something super interesting. The campsites that we all enjoy in the Boundary Waters, what's a good campsite to us today has probably always been a really good campsite. So that means people have probably been camping in Boundary Waters campsites going back hundreds of years through the Voyagers, the Ojibwe, the Dakota, and the people who lived here before then. And the area near the legacy tree used to be a campsite, and now it no longer is because they're trying to keep people from overusing the site. But it just makes you think about how many people throughout history, throughout this tree's life, would have camped near it and lived near it. And then this tree, of course, is quite a survivor, having survived countless wildfires, storms, droughts likely, and then, of course, like a lot of the forest around it was cut down for logging. And for whatever reason, maybe because it's kind of unsightly and not super big, they never cut this tree down.
Right. Okay, during much of that timeline, people visiting or being around this tree would have been Native Americans living in Minnesota. And there's a key source in the story, Heart Warrior Chosa, and she is Ojibwe? And she has a sort of a background with this tree.
Yeah, Heart Warrior is a member of the Boy Fort band of Ojibwe, and she has a really interesting history. She used to live in the Boundary Waters. When the Boundary Waters was declared a wilderness, the government bought, many landowners out, but some people who were already living there were sort of grandfathered in and allowed to stay. Most people know of Dorothy Moulter, the root beer lady, but the Chosa family also was allowed to stay in the Boundary Waters where their ancestors had been living for, a very long time. And she lived there off and on until the 1990s. And so she would visit this tree and bring it offerings of tobacco, which is Ojibwe custom as sort of honoring an elder. Cedar is very important in Ojibwe tradition. It's one of 4 sacred medicines in Ojibwe culture. It is sort of known as the medicine tree. Its leaves can be brewed into this medicinal tea. And so, it's very sort of reverential. And Paul Shirky, on the trips that he takes out there, sort of continues this tradition and brings tobacco to the tree and puts it sort of in the folds in between the bark and things like that.
Okay. One of the main points of the story is about climate change. There's a sort of a live issue about what may happen to this tree, that it may not survive what's going on with the climate today. So how? What's happening? Why is that the case?
Yeah. So early when I was reporting out this story and coming up with a reason for why we should go to this tree, I spoke with Lee Frelich. He is a forest researcher at the University of Minnesota. He's studied a lot of these ancient cedars in the Boundary Waters and documented some very old ones. And he's very worried about these trees and their capacity to survive in the new climate they're finding themselves in. They started growing in a completely different climate than the one they're currently found in. Cedars are very sensitive to drought, and drought has been a big recurrent issue in the Boundary Waters in recent years, and it will likely remain a persistent issue. The warming climate also shortens winters, allows certain pests and predators of cedar to grow more numerous. So there's a native moth, for example, that they call it arborvitae leaf miner, and that can have really big infestations because of the additional the warmer springs allow it to get additional generations in, and that can really do a number on the cedar as well.
And so is the tree dying, or is it...
No, I mean, the tree itself seems very healthy.
Because you say rot. I think of rot, and that seems like a bad thing for a tree.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually pretty common with these old trees. The inside just rots over time, but cedar are incredibly hardy, and without getting too much into the biology, they can actually survive with a lot of the tree like being functionally dead. So yeah, they're very hardy trees, and the legacy tree seems to be alive. But there is a concern that with repeated droughts, that it could really do a number on these trees because they are very sensitive to drought.
Yeah. Well, Anthony and Jake, thank you so much. This is a little unlike our typical situation here. This became a whole scene, kind of left like the regular Curious Land into a whole other land, but we want to reclaim it back here on the podcast because this all came from a reader or a listener at the state fair, and I think there was maybe more than one question, but it all came from people submitting questions, so we appreciate hearing from people. And thank you all for coming in.
We love going to find the answer.
Okay, that's it for today's show. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Do you have feedback for us or a question you'd like us to tackle? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.